Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Evelyn Ngatia. I'm the founder and CEO of Tekawat and 4IR Academy, and I'll be moderating today's session. Today's topic is empowering SMEs as the engine of East Africa's tech revolution. Now, just to set the scene before I introduce our panelists for today, one of the descriptions about SMEs by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, they say, in the developing world, SMEs make up 90% of the private sector and create more than 50% of jobs in their corresponding economies. In Africa, SMEs provide an estimated 80% of jobs across the continent, representing an important driver of economic growth. Now, key points to highlight there is that, SMEs are a driver for economic growth, just in line with our topic today, where SMEs are the engine of East Africa's tech revolution. Now, we know that SMEs are quite important in this time. They create jobs, they expand the tax base, and in this tech revolution, they're actually drivers of innovation. But they also face quite a number of challenges in terms of access to affordable growth capital, access to markets, unfavorable regulatory environment, but also in this digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, where we find ourselves in. We also find that there's lack of awareness of the disruption that's actually happening in the digital space, and also capacity development or lack of capacity in terms of digital skills, etc. So a key question that we're going to be addressing today is how do we empower these SMEs as the engine of East Africa's tech revolution? And I'm joined by a very knowledgeable panelists today who will help us unpack that topic. Our first panelist is Nekesa Were, who's the Director of Strategy at AfriLabs. And we have Amolo Mweno, who's the CEO of BFA Global. Unfortunately, Dr. Tony Mwansa could not make it for today's session, but I think we're adequately represented in this area. So a very warm welcome to you, Nekesa and Amolo.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Good. So just to kick starters off, and maybe I'll start with you, Nekesa. And Amolo, you can also chip into this question. From your experience, what do you think are the top 3 things that SMEs need in order to thrive?
Well, I'm going to be a bit cheeky on this question because I know we all say funding. And so funding, I feel, we shouldn't even count it as a top 3 because then you lose other information that you could potentially share. So I think funding is a given regardless who's having the conversation. But what I wanted to focus on was 3 other things. So there's knowledge, there's skill, and there's data. And when I speak to knowledge, it's really about that SMEs need to understand what it actually takes to run a business. Right. And this is where a lot of programs that train entrepreneurs come up. Right. And so how do you, for example, set your processes? What regulations should you be aware of? What kind of registrations or certifications should you have? All that kind of knowledge is really key for SMEs if they're going to succeed. And then there's skill, because skill is different from having knowledge. It's one thing to know a thing, it's another thing to be able to practice it. And for me, the thing that I love about passing on skill is it's an opportunity for apprenticeship, for mentorship, to surround yourself with advisors who are with you for the long term, who you trust, who you're able to go to at any time to train you, to give you advice on, how to run your business and kind of pass on the skill to you. And then there is data. And I think that SMEs, one marker of success is if you're listening to what your data is telling you. And so as an SME, you need to have your data, or you need to know where the data is so you can use it to basically give you the analytics of how you're running your business. Are your processes working? What is the reason why your product is not selling? What is the reason why certain pieces of your process are not working like they should? And it's data that gives you those answers. So data is really key for success of SMEs. Over.
So good. I think I like what, yeah, go ahead, Amolo.
I agree with Nekesa. I guess I would say one of the things that small businesses find very difficult is finding staff who are reliable and trustworthy. So those are not really technical skills, but the soft skills that have to do with respecting or understanding the needs of the business. So I think one of the major missing skills that we have in most of the East African countries is that skill of being a good employee or a good worker that is hard to convey in a classroom setting. And I think some of the approaches that Nekesa mentioned, such as apprenticeship, could be very important in improving the level and quality of those particular skills.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think it's interesting that you say, first of all, Nekesa, that, you know, yes, capital is usually a challenge, but, you know, it shouldn't be like the top thing that we always think about, because there are other things that even come even way before we have to think about how to fund the business. And obviously what you've said, Amolo, in terms of the soft skills, which are really necessary, sometimes we overlook that and we think that, you know, what we're taught in the classroom, that's it. And, you know, or some people just think I have a great idea and I can start a business and that's all that's required. So just to follow up on that, and I think, you know, the things that you've mentioned, what they bring out is, yes, they're the top three things that SMEs need, in order to thrive, but it's also on the flip side, the challenges that they face, such that, you know, they experience those stumbling blocks, that they're not able to grow beyond a certain area. But my follow-up question is to you, Nekesa, again. Back to the capital, back to growth capital. We can't ignore it. It's still something that a lot of people face as a challenge. So we have a gap in terms of capital providers who have excess. On one side, we have the capital providers who have they have capital, excess capital, if I may say, but they're not able to deploy it, whether they're not able to find viable projects, viable businesses, or you know, businesses that fit their risk return profile. Then on the other side, you have SMEs who are looking for capital, but they're not able to access it. What causes this gap, and how can we bridge this gap?
Well, I think there's several things. Just mentioning a few. I think one, there is a lack of, let's say, understanding or relating between the capital providers and the SMEs. And what I mean by this is, and thankfully we are now transitioning out of this space, but you found a few years back, there was so many capital providers that really relied on that initial pitch that an SME made and that so-called hockey stick. And so this promise that, or these projections and the increase in sales and so on. So the hockey stick now it goes from down to up, and that's what SMEs were promising, and this is what the capital providers were buying. And so at the end of the day, this is all they were looking for. And if you didn't present them with these projections that you had promised, then you were a failure. But what I think is great about the landscape now is that the capital providers are beginning to understand that it's a lot more than that initial interaction and that initial promise that the SMEs are going to make, that you're going to have some form of relationship to really understand the context of the environment in which this SME works and what kind of additional support or follow-on support they might need beyond having that funding in the bank. And I like what unconventional capital do, for example, where they look at, it's not just giving you money, but then they also are mentoring and they're offering financial advice. They say investment, mentorship, and financial advice at your fingertips. That's their tagline. And also they have a tool, so they use data. It's really a data-driven decision whether or not they're going to fund you, right? And so yes, there's the face-to-face interaction, but then it's also what is the data telling them about your business, and does it make great financial sense for them to support you? And if it does, you get the funding, but then it's more than that. They also offer you, the financial literacy and the mentorship as well. But I think it's also about SMEs sometimes not truly understanding what it takes to unlock that capital. So it's one thing, again, to make that initial pitch, but when you come into the due diligence process and we begin to interrogate your books, for funders, the one thing they're going to look at is if you have the processes in place to use the money that they are giving you and use it well. And if you don't, it's an automatic, disqualification. And I think that there are times when SMEs don't truly appreciate that there's certain elements when you're going to a capital provider that you need to go to them with and say, listen, I am actually ready for the kind of funding that I am asking you for. And so there's still some work to do in that regard for the SMEs to be investor ready. And then I think also it's just sometimes SMEs are going to give up too soon. I've heard of so many entrepreneurs who have pitched 50 times, 100 times and gotten 99 no's and then one yes. And that one yes is the money that then helps you to scale your business. So there's times when SMEs just they don't hang in there too long. Long enough. Again, perhaps this is a very unrealistic expectation. Perhaps they've looked at other environments, other ecosystems where funding seems to be unlocked a lot easier. But I think the reality for us on the ground is that it's going to take quite a while. I know entrepreneurs who fly to Silicon Valley and knock on doors and are there for a month just trying to unlock capital. I know SMEs that are going to attend any pitching competition that they can get their hands on, just to get their name out there. Even if you don't win, you just want for the potential investors to have you on their radar. I know of SMEs that join incubators or accelerators, again, just to work within that environment where there is someone on your side who's constantly pitching your product and telling people about you, specifically investors about you. And I think the final thing, I guess, that I would say about where this discrepancy is that we are not investing enough in social capital. And I'll say this goes both ways. It's again about building that relationship so that it's one thing, again, for the pitch, it's one thing to receive an investor deck, but it's another thing to actually get to know the investor or get to know the SME. And I really believe that where you have successful funder SME relationships, they really are based on those two entities having invested a lot of time in not just the financial transaction, but then also in developing a relationship where they trust each other and understand what expectations are from both ends. Yeah, so there's so many things, but for me, I think these are the key ones that I constantly see in the environment in which I work.
Yeah, and I think you've raised a very interesting point about, relationship, which is very important because sometimes you find that there's a disconnect between the SME and the capital providers in the sense of, they need to, where they converge in terms of understanding the business itself, that it's not just one size fits all in that sense, and I'm speaking in terms of where the capital provider looks at a portfolio or, a number of businesses and may look at them as, one size fits all in terms of what they're looking for. And if, the SME does not have that in place, then, it's a problem. But it has to go deeper into understanding the business, the seasonality of the business and all that. So that's a good point. But just following up on what you talked about the investor deck. So maybe for someone who doesn't understand, what are those things that, are key things in that investor deck that they should be looking out for to make themselves investor ready? Well, I'm not a funder, but I like to listen to them and what their expectations are of SMEs a lot. And what's coming out for me
especially the last year or since the pandemic, actually, interestingly, I think funders are beginning to have a more of an appreciation for really wanting to understand where these SMEs or these entrepreneurs are coming from and what drives them. And so what I know now, having listened to them, is that the entrepreneur's story is very important, right? And this is not your business story. This is about you and your journey into where you are now. So it's like the pre-pitch. It's about them getting to know you as an individual, getting to know you as an entrepreneur, getting to know you as someone that wants to have economic impact. You know, how, if they were to present you to their colleagues, to other investors, what is your story that makes you such an incredible person that they would then want to interact with and say, so tell me about your business now, because I totally resonate with you and I know where you're coming from. So that's one thing. And then
sorry, can I just comment on that?
Yes.
And I think you may know that BFA Global runs a fintech accelerator called the Catalyst Fund, which operates in Kenya and several other countries. I think one of the concerns that we have, and that I have certainly, is that personalized view from the investors is what contributes to a great extent to the tendency for investors to choose expat founders, male founders who have studied in Western countries. That making it very important that the pitch is about the individual is part of what's made limitations and difficulties for local founders. So when I hear that, I'm nervous that, investors, and we're amongst the investor pack, but that we actually have to struggle against that and not emphasize or valorize the idea that it's all about the individual before any of their business fundamentals can be reviewed, because of the natural tendency of everybody to like people who are like them.
I absolutely agree with that. And one of the things we always say in this ecosystem, at the end of the day, it's the funders' money, and they know what it is that they're looking for, that they want to invest in. And so they have their key things that they would be looking for as far as the business. And that's absolutely true. I 100% agree with Omolo. However, my point is that there's such a diversity in terms of investors. And this is why I feel like this is a pre-pitch that some investors love to invest their time in actually getting to know the person. But when it comes to the actual pitch, it really is about your product. And are you able to make the case that it's a product that the market wants and that you would be able to sell, and that there is a market for it beyond certain. So are you able to make the case, for example, that you could scale it outside of Kenya, outside of East Africa? Right now, there's a lot of investors whom, for it to be a return on investment for them, the market has to be quite sizable. It can't be a community, it can't be a county, it can't be a country. It has to be a lot more than that, right? So you need to be able to make the case for that. You need to be able to make the case that you're the right person or the right team to build that product. And you need to be able to say why your product and your team and the way that you're going about building this product stands out from perceived competition or other people that may be in the same sector as you. So at the end of the day, everyone's really looking to find good value for their money, and your deck really needs to make that case. But I still am a really huge believer in the social capital aspect of it, which goes beyond what your pitch deck says, which everyone presents their best foot forward. I think that several investors now, when they invest in the product, are also to some extent investing in the people behind the product, believing that those are the right people to get the product to the state that it could be in, where it's profitable for everyone concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also brings in the story of the why. What's the why of the business, of the entrepreneur, and why they set up the business? What's their story? What are their values? Because sometimes an organization actually represents the values of the founder or the founders in that sense. So I think it's a very important piece to also understand what's the why of the business. And also, what are their values and what's the story behind them?
Yeah.
So,
can I just as a final comment,
yeah,
that because
sure.
what you said really just got me thinking about, reminded me about the why. So when the entrepreneurs talk about the why, they then really tend to go into the passion, and so you can tell how passionate an entrepreneur is about a product, right? But they need to not fall into the trap of believing that because they were so passionate about how they presented it, that automatically makes them investable. You really need to marry the passion with an actual product that exists and that is able to scale. So entrepreneurs need to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to look at both sides. Yeah. So let me come back to you, Amolo, in the sense of you have a good view in terms of digital hubs. So my question around that is that in this digital era, we're seeing the rise of digital hubs, and that could be, digital innovation hubs, competence centers, like Industry 4.0 competence centers. We have regulatory sandboxes, etc. Those kind of hubs. So why would a startup or an SME want to plug into such hubs, and what do they stand to benefit?
Yeah, so I think to Nekesa's point about the business being in a social context or setting, one of the important things that you get in belonging to a community is you get the community aspects, both other people who are walking the same journey with you, and also potentially access to investors or suppliers or customers that come to the hub because all of you are there. So I think that's I think it's helpful, and also to some extent you'd have access to talent, again, either people who are in similar business that you may decide to work with them or to combine forces, or you pick them up because their enterprise has come to a halt. So I think it's quite helpful. And I don't see any real downside to it, although you may suggest some. I think it's beneficial. People are afraid that, my idea will be stolen. But I think whenever people say, my idea, people need to understand that the difficult part is not having the idea. The difficult part is executing in the real world. And I think people have much more to gain from being in a hub than trying to execute alone out there in the world with none of those connections. And even more so, people have more to gain from starting their business rather than hiding or protecting their idea. So I think it's useful and positive development in our environment that now we have so many options for hubs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the pooling of resources as well, in terms of being able to access talent, and what you brought out, access to investors, access to customers, and also a community. I think sometimes we get discouraged as entrepreneurs, and now I'm talking about maybe startups in that sense. You get kind of discouraged when you're walking the journey alone. So it helps to actually have people who have walked that journey or are walking that journey with you, and just, feed off each other and find out what the other person is doing. How can you do it better, etc. Nekesa, I'm sure you have something to add to that point.
Yes, I love to hear other people talk about the value of community, because it's not always something that we see a lot of in terms of this conversation, and how important communities are. But for me, that's the number one thing, the importance of having these digital hubs, or any kind of hubs, really. It's just the importance of surrounding yourself with a community that believes in your product and that believes in you as an individual. I'll say anytime that I'm affiliated to a hub, I'm going to go all out. I'm going to be an ambassador for any product that's coming out of that hub, any founder that's coming out of that hub, right? And even if there's a million other people solving for the same challenge, I really would be pitching that person, because that's who I know, that's who I've been watching grow within the context of the innovation hub. And so it really is a great opportunity for funders to take advantage of people within their spaces that are willing to go all out for them, that are willing to be ambassadors for them. And for me, that's the key importance of having, or being part of these communities. The digital innovation hubs, obviously, like you said, yes, the 4IR, just being in that kind of environment, a safe environment, allows you to take advantage of those kinds of technologies, and not just take advantage of them, but take advantage of them, again, with community. And so people that are versed in these technologies, people that are able to show you how easily you could go about adopting them, people that have researched them, so that you're not starting from scratch, but you're really leveraging already existing knowledge from academics, from mentors, from seasoned business people. It really is a great, safe environment for you to test and deploy your product. And I appreciate that I appreciate them for that as well. And then finally, with regards to the sandboxes, so the regulatory sandboxes, for example. So yes, as an SME, you really want to be involved you want to be in a regulatory sandbox, because then you have a true appreciation for where they're coming from when they're building these regulations, and so on. But then on the flip side, I think that being part of a regulatory sandbox also gives you, as an SME, the opportunity to influence those regulations. I think having SMEs, having startups within the regulatory sandboxes enables regulators to see practically what impact the regulations they're coming up with have on SMEs and startups. And so in that regard, they're able to make those regulations so they're more practical. So that interaction between regulators and SMEs is really critical. And so for that reason, I really appreciate the regulatory sandboxes and what they have to offer.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree about that. But let me jump back to you, Amolo, and this is just a follow-up to what we're talking about in terms of digital hubs. And from your experience in terms of interactions with SMEs, do you feel that there's an awareness of the fourth industrial revolution, the technology revolution, the digital disruption? Do you feel like SMEs are actually aware of what's happening and its impact on their business?
So I think distinct from, we've been talking about startups really, and startups, in the tech or digital space obviously are extremely aware. When we talk of SMEs in the broader economy, I think, yes, there's reasonably good awareness. I mean, maybe not in so many words, but they are adopters of social media and digital tools and digital payments. I think they're not as aware of some of the resources, such as the hubs that you've mentioned, that could potentially be useful to them. And I think there's still a ways to go in terms of some of the tools being appropriate and helpful to them. I think we'd see very broad and quick adoption if the right proposition is made to them. I think East Africa, with the high penetration of mobile money and high digital adoption, is quite positive. People regard it positively and are willing to test and try things. So I think that, there could be better outreach for certain types of services and products, but overall, I think there's good awareness.
Okay, that's good to know. It's good to know that at least we are somewhere, and I guess specifically in East Africa, and also the wider Africa region. Nekesa,
well, I think it's not as true at all in the wider Africa region. Like East Africa is a world leader in terms of the adoption of mobile money and mobile banking, and that's an opportunity that people are taking advantage of, even if it's not a headline in their business the same way it may be for the tech startups.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nekesa, you have anything to add there?
No, I think Komodo covered it quite well. I think the only thing that I'd say in my space, what I've seen is, yes, there is really fast adoption for modern technologies. Our curiosity as a community is, as a generation even, is outstanding. And so just the amount of people that are going out of their way to begin to understand the new technologies, how to take advantage of them, how to incorporate those into their businesses, and understanding that just using these technologies many times could be the key to giving you that edge over other people working in the same space as you. So definitely there is a great rate of adoption happening, but then we also can't forget that there is a pipeline. And so there still are those for whom there's going to be will need to have an extra effort put in to introduce them to these technologies as and when they are ready for them. I mean, you also need to be cognizant of what stage this entrepreneur is at. Are they at the stage of really still wanting to understand what does it take to be an entrepreneur? Where do I find the kind of support that I need? How do I make sure that my product makes sense for my community? And then would then need to determine, is that the kind of entrepreneur for whom it would be a priority at this stage to introduce modern technologies, or are there other things that are fundamental to them? Are there infrastructural issues that are far more fundamental and of more use for them, for us to figure out before we begin to introduce them to modern technologies? So there is really a broad spectrum of entrepreneurs, which based off of what your work is, then you need to pay attention to these entrepreneurs. But for sure, the rate of adoption is incredible across the region.
Yeah, I think, that's absolutely true. And I see one trend that really is picking up or has picked up in Europe is, the competence centers. And especially these are around Industry 4.0. So, the fourth industrial revolution, it's emerging technologies, specifically in the manufacturing sector, where they recognize that SMEs are lagging behind. So the larger corporates are able to adopt these emerging technologies, but the SMEs, and obviously the larger corporates, because they have the capital, they're able to, they have the know-how, technical know-how, etc. So it's about how do they give back, and these competence centers are more or less like PPPs, like public-private partnerships between government and private sector, large corporates, where everyone brings to that pool what their strength is. So if your strength is capital, if your strength is the technical know-how, then that's what you bring, and it's in essence to raise the standard, especially for SMEs, because they notice that they could lag behind. So we can't say that we are going to all thrive in this fourth industrial revolution if we're leaving behind the 90%, the SMEs who are really the engine of the tech revolution. Yeah. So let me go back to you, Amolo. Now, the nature of work is changing in this digital era, and we're seeing, the gig economy is taking shape. And we also have, the SDGs, the target of 2030 to have a better, people, planet, environment, etc., and ensuring that no one is left behind. How are we getting the informal sector to participate in this digital economy?
So I think the first thing is that the informal sector is already participating in the digital economy through social media and social commerce. So people selling things on Facebook or via WhatsApp. Instagram is a big, obviously, e-commerce driver. It's very widespread for anyone who's in a retail business. Including in the informal sector. So I think we expect that only to increase, and more of what we term informal businesses to semi-formalize by joining formal online platforms such as Jumia, and even the semi-formalization step of taking up a Lipa na M-Pesa or a mobile money payment, business payment app. So I think this is already ongoing, and the challenge really is to encourage it without overburdening with taxes and regulation, yet at the same time, taxes and regulation are necessary. We can't have 90% of our economy that's untaxed, and certainly the standards of employment in terms of is the work well paid and is it under reasonable working conditions? It's important. So I think it's a difficult balancing act to place that burden of formalization at the right level, where it can encourage informal businesses to increasingly formalize and at the same time bring them into the formal economy with its strictures and benefits for employees. So I think that's a course that all of our governments are going to be charting carefully over the next several years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just like you mentioned earlier about, us being ahead in terms of the mobile money revolution, but you've touched on something about taxes and regulation, which I just want to ask a follow-up question before we wrap up, because I think we're running out of time. When you talk about policy and regulation, what are some of the interesting policy initiatives or regulation that you think, whether existing or in the pipeline, that would actually encourage digital innovation?
So I think obviously the governments in East Africa have been quite positive towards digital innovation, and the regulatory sandbox that Nekesa has mentioned is a good way to allow experimentation and yet at the same time to keep an eye on what's going on. I think it would be good for government to look more into labor organizing and labor protections as the gig economy grows. So that those can grow with the growth of the gig sector and not lag way behind and end up where government has to step in a heavy-handed way. And I think something similar about taxation, where government should set some platforms, just as they do for formal sector workers, but set some platforms below which taxes are not expected and then grade slowly upwards. But I think it's not extremely clear where they should draw those lines or what activities they should focus on for taxation. So I think maybe there are sandbox-like approaches that can also work in that area.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nekesa, do you want to add anything, especially, anything to do with regulation and SMEs?
I think I'd just encourage the SMEs to plug into those conversations. Even as they go about running their businesses, they also need to be involved in any policies coming up that would affect them. I feel that they're real experts in determining what works for SMEs, what works for micro enterprises, what works for startups within the policy space is actually those exact people, the startups, the SMEs, because they've been walking that journey. They know exactly what it is to enable, or what they would need to enable the kind of work or the kind of businesses that they're wanting to grow. So any and every opportunity that they can get to plug into the conversation, I would encourage SMEs to definitely take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think that's really all we had time for, but I just want to ask maybe Amolo and Nekesa in like half a minute or less, what's your, parting shot for today?
I think it's just to say that the title of this talk, that the SMEs really are the driver of the technological revolution in Africa, and we need to support and encourage and further develop that for all of our better futures.
Yeah. Great. Nekesa?
I'd say that no one should suffer in silence. There is support and there's communities across the region. And I'll drop some links into the chat box as well for anyone that's looking for any kind of support around training, around funding, around business modeling, whatever you need. There is support across the region for sure. I know, because I'm in that space and I do it myself. So don't drown in silence, but reach out for people that can support you to build your business.
Great. Thank you so much. It was such an interesting discussion. I've also gained so much knowledge, and I'm sure everyone in our audience has. So a very big thank you to you, Amolo, and to you, Nekesa, for the great insights that you've given us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.